In the grand auction hall, murmurs and disinterest filled the air as the spotlight fell on a horse lying motionless in the center of the ring. The chestnut stallion's coat bore scars that told silent stories of hardship and neglect. The auctioneer's voice rang out, desperate to spark interest. "Who will start the bidding? Do I hear an offer?" But the crowd remained unmoved. Laughter rippled through the room, and someone muttered, "What's the point?" "That horse isn't worth a dime." Whispers grew louder, laced with ridicule. "It looks like it's given up on life," a woman in a designer dress remarked, her tone dripping with disdain. Others nodded, their judgments sharp and final. The horse's eyes seemed dull, its spirit crushed by years of suffering. In that grand, glittering hall, it was clear that this animal didn't belong. It was a spectacle of rejection, and no one spared it a second thought. Until the unexpected happened. From the back of the room, a chair scraped against the floor, breaking the rhythm of cruel remarks. A young man, dressed in plain clothes and out of place amidst the polished crowd, stood up. His voice was steady, though not loud. "I'll take him," he said, his words cutting through the air like a knife, heads turned in disbelief. "Him? Are you serious?" a man sneered, but the young man ignored the chuckles and shaking heads. His eyes were fixed on the horse, and there was something in his expression that silenced even the harshest critics. The room fell into an uneasy quiet as he approached the ring. After completing the payment, the young man walked up to the fallen animal, crouching down to meet its gaze. The horse flinched but didn't turn away. The boy leaned closer, whispering something softly, words no one else could hear. To everyone's shock, the horse's ears twitched, and for the first time that night, it lifted its head. The crowd exchanged bewildered glances. "What does he think he's doing?" someone murmured. The days that followed were nothing short of astonishing. News spread quickly about the once-forgotten horse, now thriving under the care of its unlikely new owner. The transformation was undeniable. The stallion, once deemed useless, began displaying remarkable strength and intelligence. Its gait was proud, its eyes alive with purpose. People who had mocked the young man at the auction started to wonder if they had been blind to something extraordinary. But what had the young man done to ignite such a change in the horse? And why did the bond between them feel so unshakable, as if their paths had been destined to cross? The answers to those questions were about to unfold in ways that no one could have predicted. The morning sun bathed the small, modest stable in a warm glow as the young man, whose name was Ethan, stood silently watching the horse he had named Phoenix, inspired by the creature's ability to rise from the ashes, just as he believed this horse could rise from its past. Phoenix stood stiffly in the corner, his muscles taut, his movements cautious. His scars, both visible and invisible, had built a fortress around his trust. Ethan knew he had taken on an uphill battle, but something deep inside told him this horse was worth it. Ethan spent hours sitting outside Phoenix's stall, reading softly or simply existing in the horse's presence. He never forced interaction. He knew trust couldn't be rushed. On one quiet afternoon, as Ethan sat with his back against the wooden panels, Phoenix took a hesitant step toward him. The sound of hooves on the straw made Ethan glance over his shoulder, his heart leaping at the sight. Phoenix's ears twitched nervously, but for the first time, he seemed curious rather than fearful. The breakthrough, however, didn't come without its challenges. The next morning, Ethan decided it was time to lead Phoenix out of the stable and into the pasture. As soon as the bridle touched Phoenix's head, the horse reared up, letting out a panicked whinny that echoed across the field. Ethan quickly let go, his hands trembling, but he didn't yell or scold. Instead, he stepped back, giving Phoenix space, murmuring soothing words. It was clear that Phoenix's scars ran deeper than physical pain. They were rooted in betrayal. As days turned into weeks, a pattern emerged. Ethan would try, fail, and try again, each time making just the slightest progress. He began to piece together fragments of Phoenix's story from his reactions. The way Phoenix flinched at sudden movements or froze at the sound of raised voices hinted at a past filled with cruelty. Ethan couldn't shake the anger that bubbled inside him at the thought of what Phoenix must have endured, but that anger wasn't for Phoenix to carry. Ethan made a silent vow to replace every bad memory with one of kindness and patience. One evening, as the sky painted itself in hues of orange and purple, Ethan decided to try something new. He brought out a brush, careful to move slowly as he approached Phoenix. At first the stallion stiffened, his muscles coiled as if ready to flee. But Ethan's touch was gentle, his strokes rhythmic and reassuring. Slowly, Phoenix's rigid stance softened. His head dipped slightly, and a soft exhale escaped his nostrils. For the first time, he seemed to relax under human hands. It was a small victory, but to Ethan, it felt monumental. What Ethan didn't know was that Phoenix's transformation was stirring whispers in the town. Those who had mocked him at the auction were starting to notice. Some were curious, others skeptical, but all were waiting to see how far this unlikely partnership could go. As Ethan stood beside Phoenix that evening, brushing his coat under the fading light, he felt a flicker of hope. Yet deep down, he sensed that this was only the beginning. Something bigger was on the horizon, something that neither he nor Phoenix could yet foresee. The days blended together as Ethan and Phoenix settled into their routine. Each morning, Ethan would rise before dawn, his boots crunching on the gravel path leading to the stable. Phoenix had grown accustomed to his presence, nickering softly when Ethan appeared, though his guarded eyes still carried a hint of skepticism. It was progress, but Ethan knew the road ahead remained long and uncertain. He didn't mind. He had learned to cherish the small victories, each glance of trust, every step closer. One afternoon, Ethan decided it was time to test Phoenix's boundaries further. He led the stallion to the open pasture, the rolling fields glowing under the eye. Golden sunlight. For a moment, Phoenix hesitated, his hooves planted firmly on the ground as if afraid of what lay ahead. Ethan didn't pull or push. Instead, he stood beside him, allowing Phoenix to take his time. Finally, with a cautious step, the stallion moved forward. The sight made Ethan's chest tighten. It was as though Phoenix was learning to reclaim the freedom he had lost. But the serenity of the moment was shattered when a loud, sudden crack echoed through the field. Startled, Phoenix bolted, his eyes wide with panic. Ethan's heart sank as he sprinted after him, shouting the horse's name. Phoenix galloped wildly, his movements erratic as he dodged invisible dangers in his mind. The past had come rushing back to him, and it was as if he were running from ghosts. Ethan finally caught up to him near the edge of the pasture, his breath labored. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "You're safe now." That evening, as Ethan sat outside the stable, his exhaustion evident, an older man approached. It was Mr. Grayson, a retired rancher who had been a quiet observer of Ethan's efforts. "You've got a good heart, son," he said, his voice gravelly, with age. "But you can't fix what's broken if you don't understand where the cracks are." Ethan looked up, confused. Mr. Grayson continued, "That horse has seen things, endured things that you can't imagine. If you want to help him, you'll need to find out where he came from." The words lingered in Ethan's mind long after Mr. Grayson had left. That night he couldn't sleep. Questions swirled in his thoughts. What had Phoenix endured? Who had hurt him so deeply, and why had no one cared enough to stop it? Determined, Ethan made a decision. He would uncover Phoenix's past, no matter what it took. The horse deserved more than just a new life. He deserved closure. As the first light of dawn broke the horizon, Ethan stood at the stable door, watching Phoenix with a newfound resolve. The stallion looked back at him, his eyes calmer than before, as if sensing Ethan's determination. The journey to uncover Phoenix's story would not be easy, but Ethan was ready. Little did he know, the truth he sought would challenge not only his understanding of the horse, but also his own beliefs about trust, forgiveness, and redemption. Ethan's search for answers began with a visit to the auction house where he had first laid eyes on Phoenix. The manager, a stout man with a gruff demeanor, barely looked up from his paperwork when Ethan entered. "That horse? You're better off forgetting about him," the man muttered, his tone dismissive. But Ethan was persistent, his voice firm as he explained, "I need to know where he came from. I need to help him heal." After some reluctance, the manager sighed, pulling out an old, dusty file. "This is all I've got, don't expect much." The file was thin, containing only a brief description of Phoenix and the name of his previous owner, Victor Harland. Ethan's heart sank at the lack of detail, but the name was a start. Harland's address was scribbled in the margins, a ranch on the outskirts of town. Ethan thanked the manager and left, clutching the file tightly as he walked back to his truck. A sense of unease crept over him. What kind of person had left Phoenix in such a broken state? The drive to Harland's ranch was long and filled with uncertainty. When Ethan finally arrived, he was met with a scene that mirrored his worst fears. The property was run down, the fences sagging, and the barn doors hanging loosely on their hinges. As he approached the house, an older man stepped onto the porch, his face weathered, his eyes sharp but devoid of warmth. "What do you want?" Harland barked, his tone laced with irritation. Ethan swallowed hard and introduced himself, explaining why he was there. At first, Harland refused to talk, dismissing Phoenix as just another useless animal. But as Ethan pressed, his persistence chipping away at the man's defenses, Harland's facade began to crack. He admitted that Phoenix had been part of a string of horses used for grueling work, pushed beyond their limits with no regard for their well-being. "He wasn't strong enough," Harland said bluntly, as if it excused his actions. Ethan clenched, his fists, anger simmering beneath the surface, but he forced himself to remain calm. Before leaving, Ethan asked one final question. "Why did you send him to the auction instead of putting him down?" Harland hesitated, his gaze faltering. "I guess I thought maybe someone would see something in him I didn't," he muttered, almost as if ashamed. Ethan left the ranch with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. Phoenix had endured more than he had imagined. The weight of his past felt heavier now, but it also fueled Ethan's resolve to make things right. That evening, back at the stable, Ethan sat beside Phoenix, running a hand gently along the stallion's mane. "I know where you came from," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "and I promise you'll never go through that again." Phoenix turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting Ethan's for the first time. There was a flicker of trust, a silent understanding between them. The bond they shared was growing stronger, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this journey was far from over. The past had been uncovered, but it still cast a long shadow over their future. The truth about Phoenix's past weighed heavily on Ethan. The image of Harland's cold indifference and the conditions Phoenix had endured replayed in his mind like a haunting memory. Ethan spent hours sitting by Phoenix's stall, sharing the silence with the horse. "You've been through hell," he murmured one evening, stroking Phoenix's scarred neck. "But I promise that's not who you are anymore." Phoenix blinked slowly, his ears twitching as if he understood. For Ethan, that small reaction was a glimmer of hope. The next day, Ethan decided to test Phoenix's progress again. He led him to the open pasture, this time carrying nothing but a halter and a lead rope. There was no pressure, only patience. Phoenix hesitated at first, his hooves rooted in place, but Ethan stood beside him, giving the stallion space to decide. After a long moment, Phoenix took a step forward, then another, until they were both standing in the middle of the field. Ethan couldn't help but smile. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. As Ethan continued working with Phoenix, word of their bond spread through the small town. People began stopping by the stable, their curiosity piqued by the story of the auction reject and the determined young man. Some came to offer support, while others seemed to doubt Ethan's efforts, their skepticism thinly veiled behind polite smiles. Among them was Claire, a local veterinarian who had heard about Phoenix's condition. "You're doing something incredible," she told Ethan, her voice warm and sincere. "But he's going to need more than patience. His body has been through a lot." Claire's words struck a chord with Ethan. She offered to examine Phoenix and help him develop a plan for the horse's recovery. Ethan agreed, grateful for her expertise. As Claire worked, she pointed out the areas where Phoenix still carried tension, the physical remnants of his trauma. "This won't be easy," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "But he has the will to fight. I can see it in his eyes." Ethan nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. With Claire's guidance, he began incorporating gentle exercises and stretches into Phoenix's routine. One evening, as Ethan was brushing Phoenix under the soft glow of the barn lights, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. The stallion leaned into the brush, his eyes half closed in what could only be described as contentment. Ethan paused, his heart swelling with emotion. For a moment it felt as though Phoenix had finally let go of some of the weight he carried. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start, a sign that trust and healing were possible. But just as Ethan began to feel hopeful, a knock on the barn door shattered the quiet night. He turned to see a tall figure silhouetted against the moonlight. The man stepped inside, his boots crunching on the straw. "You must be Ethan," he said, his voice low and steady. "I've been looking for that horse." Ethan froze, his grip tightening on the brush. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone guarded. The man took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "I'm someone who knows exactly what that horse is capable of," he said, gesturing toward Phoenix. "He was part of a training program for competitive endurance, but Harland, well, he pushed him too far." Ethan could feel his pulse quicken as the man spoke. "Why are you here?" Ethan asked, keeping his tone firm despite the rising unease in his chest. The man's expression softened, but there was something guarded in his demeanor. "When I heard someone bought that horse, I had to see for myself," he said. "He's special, you know, more than Harland ever realized, but he's also damaged. Horses like him, they don't always recover." Ethan stepped in front of Phoenix protectively. "He's recovering now," he said. "I don't need your judgment or your doubts." The man raised his hands in mock surrender. "Easy, kid. I'm not here to take him. I just thought you'd want to know the truth." As the man began to explain, a picture of Phoenix's past became clearer. The stallion had been bred for endurance races, pushed to his limits in grueling training sessions. Harland had seen potential, but had ignored the signs of physical and emotional strain. When he broke down, Harland tossed him aside. The man admitted a flicker of guilt crossed his face. He didn't care about the damage he'd done, but I saw what that horse could be with the right care. He could thrive again. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then why didn't you help him back then?" The man hesitated, his silence speaking volumes. After a long pause, he spoke again. "I wasn't strong enough to stand up to Harland. That's something I have to live with. But you've already done more for that horse than anyone else ever did." Ethan didn't respond immediately, his mind racing with questions and emotions. The man's story confirmed what Ethan had suspected all along. Phoenix wasn't broken by nature but by neglect and cruelty. "So why tell me this now?" Ethan finally asked. The man's eyes met his, steady and sincere. "Because you're his second chance and I want to help if you'll let me." Ethan didn't know whether to trust the man, but one thing was certain. This man knew things about Phoenix that could be crucial to his recovery. After a moment of silence, Ethan nodded reluctantly. "All right," he said, his voice cautious. "But if you're going to help, it's on my terms. Phoenix comes first." The man nodded in agreement. "That's the only way it should be." As the man turned to leave, Ethan glanced back at Phoenix, who stood quietly watching them. The stallion's journey wasn't over, and with this new twist, Ethan realized they were stepping into uncharted territory. The man returned the next morning, this time with a bag slung over his shoulder and an air of determination. Ethan watched warily as the old man approached Phoenix's stall, his movements slow and deliberate. "Horses like him need patience, but they also need to be reminded of their strength," he said, pulling a bundle of ropes and a lightweight saddle from his bag. "We'll start with groundwork. No pressure, no stress, just showing him he can trust himself again." Ethan hesitated but nodded. He wasn't sure he trusted the man yet, but Phoenix's progress was his only priority. In the past, the man demonstrated a series of exercises using soft commands and fluid movements to guide Phoenix. At first, the stallion's reactions were uncertain, his muscles tense with each step. But the man's calm, practiced approach seemed to resonate with him. Ethan watched as Phoenix began to follow the man's lead, his ears flicking forward and his steps growing steadier. "See that?" the man said, glancing at Ethan. "He's starting to get it. It's not about control, it's about partnership." Ethan absorbed every detail, determined to learn as much as he could for Phoenix's sake. The days that followed were a delicate balance of trust-building and careful progression. Ethan took over more of the exercises, his bond with Phoenix growing, stronger with each session. The stallion began to move with more confidence, his strides longer, his head held higher. For the first time, Ethan saw glimpses of the horse Phoenix was meant to be. But with progress came new challenges. Phoenix still had moments of fear, flashbacks triggered by sudden noises or unfamiliar situations. Ethan's heart ached every time, but he refused to give up. One afternoon, as they worked together in the field, the man approached Ethan with a thoughtful expression. "There's something else you need to know," he said, his voice low. Phoenix wasn't just bred for endurance. He was trained for high-stakes races. And if you want him to truly recover, he needs to face the track again. Not for competition, but to prove to himself that he can. Ethan's stomach twisted at the idea. The thought of putting Phoenix back in a place that had caused him so much pain felt wrong. "I don't know if he's ready," Ethan said, his voice heavy with doubt. The man placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You'll know when the time is right. But remember, this isn't about the past anymore. It's about showing him what he's capable of." Now, Ethan looked back at Phoenix, who stood calmly beside them, his gaze steady and full of quiet strength. The idea of returning to a racetrack felt like a daunting risk. But deep down, Ethan knew the man was right. Phoenix's journey wasn't just about healing, it was about reclaiming what had been stolen from him, and Ethan was determined to be there, every step of the way. The idea of bringing Phoenix to a racetrack lingered in Ethan's mind for days. He wrestled with doubt and fear, questioning whether it was the right decision. Phoenix had come so far, but the memories of his past still clung to him like shadows. Could exposing him to the very environment that had broken him truly help him heal? Ethan spent long nights in the stable, sitting by Phoenix's side, seeking answers in the horse's calm but guarded gait. "If we do this, it's on your terms, not mine," he whispered one evening. Ethan shared his concerns with the man, who listened patiently before offering a solution. "There's a private track just outside town," he said. "It's quiet, no crowds, no pressure. It's the perfect place to start." The thought of a controlled environment eased Ethan's anxiety, and after much deliberation he agreed. They set a date to bring Phoenix to the track, giving the stallion time to adjust to the idea. Ethan began incorporating small changes in their routine, introducing Phoenix to objects and sounds that mimicked a racetrack without overwhelming him. When the day arrived, Ethan could feel the tension in his chest as he loaded Phoenix into the trailer. The stallion hesitated at first, but with gentle coaxing, he stepped inside. The drive to the track was silent, the hum of the engine underscoring Ethan's swirling thoughts. When they arrived, the man was already waiting, leaning against the fence with a calm, confident expression. "Take it slow," he advised as Ethan unloaded Phoenix. "This is his moment, not ours." Ethan nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he led Phoenix toward the track. At the edge of the track, Phoenix stopped, his ears swiveling as he took in the unfamiliar surroundings. His muscles tensed, his eyes darting around as if expecting danger. Ethan stood by his side, murmuring soft reassurances. "You're safe," he said, his voice steady. "I'm right here." Slowly, Phoenix took a tentative step forward, then another. Ethan walked beside him, letting the stallion set the pace. The first lap was slow and cautious, but as they continued, Phoenix's steps grew more confident. By the third lap, his gait was steady, his head held high. Watching Phoenix move across the track, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of pride and relief. The stallion wasn't just walking, he was reclaiming his power one step at a time. As they completed the final lap, Ethan stopped and turned to Phoenix, running a hand along his neck. "You did it," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Phoenix snorted, his ears pricking forward as if to say, "We did it." But as Ethan led Phoenix off the track, the man approached with a serious expression. "This was just the first step," he said. "The real challenge is still ahead." The quiet track had been a milestone, but the man's words lingered in Ethan's mind. The real challenge is still ahead. Ethan knew what he meant. Phoenix needed to confront a real racetrack with its chaos, noise, and energy. The thought filled Ethan with dread, but he couldn't deny that Phoenix had grown stronger both physically and emotionally. The stallion was no longer the defeated animal Ethan had first seen at the auction. Yet as much as Phoenix had changed, Ethan knew this next step could either cement their progress or unravel everything they'd worked for. Ethan and the man spent the following days preparing Phoenix for what was to come. They recreated the atmosphere of a crowded track as best they could, playing recordings of cheering crowds and introducing Phoenix to unfamiliar equipment. Phoenix reacted with unease at first, his old fears bubbling to the surface. But Ethan's patience never wavered. Each day, the stallion grew more accustomed to the new stimuli, his trust in Ethan anchoring him. Still, there was a part of Ethan that questioned whether he was pushing too far, too fast. When the day of the test came, Ethan felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The real racetrack was a stark contrast to the quiet one they had practiced on. The stands were empty, but the vastness of the space and the echo of distant sounds were enough to make Phoenix hesitate as they approached. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on the stallion's neck. "It's just us," he said softly. "Like always." With a deep breath, he led Phoenix toward the starting gate. The man watched from the sidelines, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. As Ethan and Phoenix entered the track, a staff member released a starting bell. The sharp clang startled Phoenix, and for a moment, Ethan feared the worst. The stallion reared slightly, his eyes wide with panic, but Ethan stayed calm, his voice steady. "You're okay," he said, gripping the lead rope with care. "I've got you." Slowly, Phoenix's breathing steadied, and his hooves returned to the ground. Ethan gave him space, letting him acclimate before asking for anything more. Minutes later, Phoenix took his first cautious step onto the track, then another. Ethan walked beside him, matching his pace. By the time they reached the halfway point, Phoenix's movements were more fluid, his ears pricked forward with curiosity rather than fear. When they completed a full lap, Ethan stopped, letting the stallion stand still and take it all in. Phoenix's chest heaved, his muscles glistening under the sunlight. But there was a calmness in his demeanor that Ethan hadn't seen before. As they exited the track, the man approached, a rare smile breaking across his face. "You've done it," he said. But Ethan knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something greater. The weeks following Phoenix's triumph at the racetrack were transformative. Word spread quickly through the town and beyond about the horse that had defied the odds. People who had once scoffed at Ethan's efforts now spoke of Phoenix with admiration, calling him a symbol of resilience. But for Ethan, it was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about giving Phoenix the life he deserved, one built on trust, patience, and second chances. As he stood outside the stable one crisp morning, watching Phoenix graze peacefully in the pasture, Ethan felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The man, who had become a constant presence in their journey, approached with a thoughtful expression. "You've done more than I thought possible," he said, leaning on the fence. "But I have to ask, what's next for you and Phoenix?" Ethan turned to look at the stallion, his gaze steady. "I don't think it's about what's next for me," he replied. "It's about what Phoenix wants. He's earned the right to choose his path now." The man nodded, a hint of respect in his eyes. "Whatever that is, you'll make sure he's ready." Ethan began to notice subtle changes in Phoenix. The stallion moved with a confidence that had once seemed impossible. His eyes, once clouded with fear, now held a quiet strength. Phoenix had found his stride, not just physically but emotionally, and it was a transformation that inspired everyone who witnessed it. Claire, the veterinarian, visited one afternoon and couldn't hide her amazement. "He's incredible," she said, running a hand along Phoenix's neck. "You've given him more than a second chance. You've given him his spirit back." Ethan realized that Phoenix's journey wasn't just his own. It had become a story that resonated with others. Schools invited Ethan to speak about resilience and compassion, and the local community organized events to celebrate Phoenix's recovery. At one of these events, a young boy approached Ethan, his eyes wide with wonder. "Is it true he used to be broken?" the boy asked, pointing to Phoenix. Ethan smiled, kneeling to meet the boy's gaze. "He wasn't broken," Ethan said gently. "He just needed someone to believe in him." As the sun set on the pasture that evening, Ethan stood beside Phoenix, their silhouettes framed by the golden light. The bond between them was unshakable, forged through challenges, heartbreak, and triumph. Ethan knew that Phoenix's story was more than just a tale of recovery. It was a testament to the power of trust and the resilience of the spirit. With one last glance at the horizon, Ethan murmured, "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Phoenix snorted softly, nudging Ethan's shoulder in response. Together, they walked back toward the stable, ready to face whatever the future held, side by side.